Even after God promised Abraham and Sarah they would have a son through whom all nations would be blessed, they both remained a childless couple, taunted by the complexities of life and old age. Sarah was barren and frustrated, so she suggested to Abraham they should have a child with her Egyptian handmaid Hagar. Abraham agreed and slept with Hagar, who became pregnant and bore a son, Ishmael. Sarah was angry and jealous when she found out, so she mistreated Hagar and made her flee into the wilderness. But what happens next is a testament to an enduring covenant, not limited by human offense or grievances. In this video, you will see how the child Ishmael grew up in the wilderness, becoming one of the ancestors of a powerful race of humans to reckon with today. Keep watching. Abraham's wife Sarah was so barren she gave her Egyptian handmaiden Hagar to Abraham so that they could have a child by her. Out of compulsion, Abraham slept with Hagar, and she spawned a child, who was named Ishmael. When Hagar conceived Ishmael by Abraham, Sarah became jealous and started mistreating her. Hagar then fled into the wilderness, where an angel of God met her and told her to return to Sarah and submit to her. The angel also promised her that her descendants, through Ishmael, would become a great nation, and that his name meant God hears. Hagar eventually gave birth to Ishmael, and Abraham circumcised him as a sign of God's covenant. Later, God also fulfilled his promise to Sarah and gave her a son named Isaac, the son of God's promise to Abraham. Genesis records that Sarah saw Ishmael mocking Isaac and demanded that Abraham send Hagar and Ishmael away. We are not sure what the word mocking here signifies. It could be Ishmael, being the elder, beating Isaac, playing too harshly with him, or laughing at him. But this displeased Sarah, leading to the decision to send the bondwoman and her son away. Abraham was reluctant, but God told him to listen to Sarah and assured him that he would also make Ishmael a great nation. Abraham gave Hagar and Ishmael some bread and water and sent them away. They wandered in the desert of Beersheba until they ran out of water. Hagar left Ishmael under a bush and cried, thinking that he would die. God heard Ishmael's cry and opened Hagar's eyes to see a water well. God also spoke to Hagar and repeated his promise to make Ishmael a great nation. Hagar and Ishmael survived and settled in the wilderness of Barren. Hagar found a wife for Ishmael from Egypt, and he had 12 sons who became the princes of the Ishmaelites and the ancestors of various Arab tribes. More on that later. Hagar's exile from Abraham's house was during a difficult time. With the toddler Ishmael, and no direction to follow, it is easy to assume that Abraham was an inconsiderate master who didn't show empathy for the plight of his servant. However, this isn't quite the truth, as servants were expressly taken care of then. God would later expressly give instructions in the book of Leviticus on how his elect should take care of those serving them. In ancient Israel, servants and children of servants were treated better than in other ancient cultures. The institution of servanthood served as protection against poverty and included numerous safeguards against abuse. Servants could own property, and it was illegal to force escaped enslaved people to return to their masters. The law was designed so that if all safeguards regarding social welfare were practiced, then poverty should not exist among ancient Israelites, and this practice would be unnecessary. This signifies that the Israelites were a compassionate and just society that cared for the welfare of all its members. Sarah insisted that Ishmael and his mother be sent away because she was jealous of them. She thought that Ishmael would not share in the inheritance with her son Isaac, who was the son of God's promise to Abraham. She also feared that Ishmael would cause trouble for her and Abraham, since he was a wild donkey of a man, according to the angel of the Lord. In the wilderness, after they were sent away, Hagar and Ishmael wandered until they reached the well of Beer Lahai Roi, where God heard the boy crying and spoke to Hagar. He told her not to be afraid and to give him water to drink. He also promised to make Ishmael a great nation because he was Abraham's offspring. Sarah later gave birth to Isaac when she was 90, fulfilling God's promise. She laughed when she heard she had given birth to a son in her old age. Isaac eventually became the heir of everything Abraham owned, while Ishmael was sent away with his mother to live in the desert of Beersheba. However, God promised that Ishmael would also become a great nation and be the father of 12 princes who would rule over their brothers. Thus, by virtue of this promise, God would fulfill his covenant with Abraham, not just to his legitimate son Isaac, but also to Ishmael. Sarah later died, and Abraham had a child with Keturah. Keturah was his second wife, whom he married after Sarah's death. According to Genesis 25 verses 1 and 2, Abraham and Keturah had 6 sons: Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. The Bible also clarifies that Keturah's child with Abraham eventually forms the descendants of Midianites. The Midianites descended from Midian, the son of Abraham and Keturah. The Midianites were also known as the Kedarites, or the Sabaean Arabs. They lived in the region of western Arabia and were involved in trade and warfare with other nations. Note, when God told Abraham his descendants would be vast on earth, like the stars in the sky, God wasn't referring to Isaac alone but to every male from his loins. Thus, we see how God carefully enacted every word he promised Abraham to the least of his descendants. The Ishmaelites descended from Ishmael, Abraham's first son, with Hagar, Sarah's Egyptian maid. Aside from the Midianites, the Ishmaelites also formed the first Arab settlements in the peninsula, known as the Arabians or the Hijazis. They lived in the region of eastern Arabia and were also involved in trade and warfare with other nations. Genesis 25 shows Ishmael had 12 sons, and Jacob, Isaac's son, begat 12 sons too. This indicates that God had a different plan and purpose for each of their descendants. Ishmael's sons became the ancestors of the Arab nations, while Isaac's sons became the ancestors of the Israelites and other countries. The number of Ishmael's sons and Isaac's sons was both different and symbolic. Ishmael's 12 sons represented the 12 tribes of the Arabs, while Isaac's descendants represented the 12 tribes of Israel. God had a different covenant and destiny for each of them. Based on the situation that led to the exile of Ishmael and her mother, it is also easy to assume they were not on good terms with Isaac, even after the death of Sarah. This could as well be true. In fact, the relationship between Ishmael and Isaac was not very close at first, because they were rivals for their father's blessing and inheritance. However, after Abraham's death, both sons buried him in the cave of Machpelah, where Sarah was also buried. Genesis 25 verse 9. This shows that they eventually reconciled their differences and respected each other as brothers. They also shared a common heritage with Abraham, whom God chose to be the father of many nations. The reconciliation between Ishmael and Isaac was a sign of respect and a fulfillment of prophecy. God had promised Abraham that he would bless his sons and make them into great nations. By burying their father together, they showed that their common faith and heritage united them. There are two other Ishmaels mentioned in the Bible besides Ishmael, son of Abraham. One was a son of Nethaniah, who assassinated Gedaliah, the governor of Judah appointed by the Babylonians, and caused a massacre of the Jews and the Chaldeans, as seen in the book of Jeremiah 40. The other was a son of Azel, a descendant of King Saul, who had 6 sons, as seen in 1 Chronicles chapter 8 verse 38 and chapter 9 verse 44. These Ishmaels were not very prominent in the biblical narrative and were not related to the Ishmaelites, the descendants of Abraham's son Ishmael. From this story we can see Ishmael was not the direct son of God's promise to Abraham, but God still protected him and blessed him for Abraham's sake. Some of the salient points that we can make of the existence of Ishmael are: Ishmael was a sign of God's grace and mercy to Hagar, who was mistreated by Sarah and driven away from Abraham's household. God heard her cry, comforted her, and gave her a son who would become a great nation. He was a test of Abraham's faith and obedience to God, who commanded him to send away his firstborn son and his mother, and to trust that God would take care of them. Abraham did as God told him, even though it grieved him deeply, and God rewarded him by making Ishmael a father of 12 princes who would rule over their brothers. Ishmael symbolized God's universal love and plan for all nations, not only the Israelites. God promised to make Ishmael a great nation and to bless him as Abraham's offspring. Ishmael became the ancestor of the Arab people, who also worshiped the God of Abraham. Through Ishmael we have seen that God's covenant with Abraham was not limited to Isaac and his descendants, but extended to Ishmael and his descendants. Since Ishmael gave rise to the Arabs, is it safe to say all Arab Muslims are direct descendants of Ishmael? In reality, the Bible mentions that Ishmael had 12 sons who became the ancestors of various Arab tribes, but it does not name all of them or their locations. Other historical sources also indicate that different groups lived in Arabia before and after Ishmael, such as the Adites, the Thamud, the Midianites, the Nabateans, and the Kedarites. Some groups may have intermarried with Ishmael's descendants, while others may have adopted their language and culture. Therefore, it is difficult to trace the exact lineage of every Arab Muslim back to Ishmael. However, some Islamic traditions claim that Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, was a descendant of Ishmael through his son Nebaioth or Kedar. This is based on genealogical records and oral traditions. The story of Ishmael shows that Ishmael's mother was Hagar, Sarah's handmaiden. After Hagar conceived Ishmael, she began to show contempt for Sarah, and Sarah responded by treating her harshly. Abraham then told Hagar to flee his home and go into the desert between Abraham's settlement and Shur. Genesis 16 describes the naming of Ishmael and God's promise to Hagar concerning Ishmael and his descendants. According to Genesis 18, Sarah conceived Isaac when she was 90. It shouldn't be surprising how a 90-year-old woman could still bear the pangs of conception and childbirth. This is because, in ancient times, humans had a longer lifespan. Thus, at 90, one could still be said to be in their midlife. This proves that God is magnificent in wonders. Nothing stands as a barrier when he wants to move in a man's life, not even age. The Apostle Paul used the story of Ishmael and Hagar as an allegory to illustrate the difference between the two covenants, the old covenant of the law and the new covenant of grace. In Galatians 4:24, Paul alleges that Hagar represented the old covenant that was given at Mount Sinai, which produced children of slavery. He said that Sarah represented the new covenant given through Christ, which had children of freedom. He noted that Ishmael represented the fleshly descendants of Abraham, who were born according to human will and who persecuted the spiritual descendants of Abraham. He said that Isaac represented the spiritual descendants of Abraham, who were born according to God's promise and who inherited God's blessing. Paul implies that Hagar and Ishmael's children were not the true heirs of God's promise, but the children of Sarah and Isaac were, meaning that the children of the old covenant were cast out, but the children of the new covenant were welcomed. Today, all Christians are the children of Sarah and Isaac, who are free from the bondage of the law and who live by the grace of God, through the Spirit, and not the flesh. I hope you enjoyed watching today's video. Do well to subscribe to this channel and turn on your notification bell. Stay tuned for more.